Welcome to the channel, folks. My name's Shane. In today's video, we're checking out two of my favorite crop sensor cameras of all time, the Panasonic LUMIX G9II and the Sony FX30. I'm going to leave this split screen up for just a moment while I talk a little bit about this video, and then I'll reveal which camera is which. Now, both of these cameras are excellent, and if you can't get great results out of one or the other, you're doing something wrong. So the image quality out of both of these cameras is spectacular. This isn't to initiate like a brand war or anything. I'm going to talk about the practical benefits of both cameras and where they might fall short if they do. Now, this video is not sponsored. If you do enjoy it or if it's helpful, please leave a thumbs up. I've had so many requests to do this video, and I'm about to let you know which one is which. But take a good look at the color science, the background blur, all that kind of stuff. Let us know which one you like the best. This is the Sony FX30, and this is the Panasonic G9II. Let's get into it.
Before we get into more comparisons, I just wanted to showcase the difference in the sensor size between both of these cameras if you're new to camera gear. So this is the G9II. It's loaded with a 25.2 megapixel micro four thirds sensor. Now this is capable of video recording up to 5.8K of resolution open gate, which uses the entirety of the sensor, and it can also do 5.7K up to 60 frames per second. Here's the Sony FX30 with its 26.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor. As you can see, the sensor in the Sony is bigger than that of the micro four thirds sensor, and this is capable of resolutions up to DCI 4K and 4K up to 120 frames per second in UHD. Now just know the image quality out of this camera is excellent, but it is capped out with those 4K resolutions.
Let's kick things off with an autofocus test. I'm using a 24mm G Master on the Sony FX30, and I've got the 10-25 at 18mm on the G9II, so 36mm full frame equivalent. We're going to just do a face detection autofocus test to begin with, and I'm just going to walk back and forth a few times here, and we'll see how they both compare. Now, one of the things I've learned about the G9II is it's really great at tracking you really far back with wide angle lenses. It's actually more reliable than the Sony, but the Sony pulls focus a little bit faster. So if you need the best in eye tracking, I'd probably give it to the Sony, although the Panasonic is extremely fast at catching you when you walk into frame and moving with you, but it sort of pulls focus just a hair behind the Sony in these type of situations, or at least in some of the tests that I've done so far, I've noticed that. But generally speaking, if you're walking, or doing anything like this, both cameras are going to work great, and they're both on par with each other. So it's very close, but I'm going to give the win to the Sony just in terms of its eye autofocus. Let's talk about the autofocus experience on both of these cameras for product showcase. So it works a little bit different. On the Sony, as you probably well know, I have to cover up my eyes for it to pull focus. If I just cover up my chin, for example, nothing's going to change. Whereas on the Panasonic, if I cover my chin, it's going to move to my hand. So it reacts a little bit sooner on the Panasonic than on the Sony. So this could be a pro or a con depending on your scenario, but just know sometimes if you're covering up your face or whatever, it may actually track your hand instead of your eye. So it really depends on your use case scenario. But if you're using either of these two on a gimbal or standing talking to the camera like this, they're both very reliable. Again, for close stuff like this, you're not going to have a problem with either. But yeah, you can see just how quick the Panasonic pulls focus to my hand without it covering my eye. Whereas on the Sony, I have to really cover up my eyeball before, or my sunglasses in this case, before it will pull focus to my hand. So yeah, just a slight variation there, but both are very good. Let's try some wide angle lenses in this backlit scenario. We're also going to test the auto exposure and autofocus in a challenging situation like this. So on the G9II, I've got the 9mm f1.7 at 1.7, and on the Sony FX30, I have the 15mm f1.4 at 1.6. So we should get a good sense of how this responds with the ISO being the same. I'm just going to move forward to the Panasonic G9II. Looks like the Sony FX30 has got me there, but as I sit on this chair, I can see some fluttering going on the Sony FX30, and this did exactly the same thing that the Sony FX3 did in this scenario. It really struggled. So yeah, these backlit situations cause the camera to do a lot of weird things on the Sony system. It ramps up the ISO up and down, or the exposure, whereas on the Panasonic it looks, at least to my eye, a little bit more consistent. I'll find all of this out in post, but I've already done a test exactly like this with the FX30 and FX3, and they both really struggled until I got to about here in the frame, and now it looks fine, and this one also looks fine. But yeah, anyway, we'll comment on this at the end of the video. but this is a test I always like to throw in because it really challenges everything when you're in auto mode.
Looking at the autofocus comparisons, it's way closer than I thought it was. The Lumix has some clear advantages in some ways, and then the Sony has some advantages in others. Where the Sony really pulls ahead is the touch to focus option, allowing you to tap on screen and have it pull focus from one point to the next. It does this with more confidence. Here's an example of the Panasonic. While it does it, and it does it well, it just doesn't do it at the same speed consistently, so I give the win there to the Sony. When it comes to eye tracking, one thing I noticed between both of these cameras is the G9 Mark II is faster at finding me when I walk back into the frame once I've left the frame, but the Sony pulls focus slightly smoother as I walk toward or away from the camera. So for eye tracking and product showcase, I do trust the Sony for this kind of stuff just that little bit more than the Lumix, but it's very close and you can get great results out of either. Human tracking at a distance works far better on the G9 Mark II. It's also far more reliable if I'm heavily backlit. There's no comparison here, the Panasonic gets the win. Tracking objects on both cameras using their tap to track or shutter button option on the G9 Mark II was great on both cameras. The tracking is sticky and they both had no issues tracking this water bottle. For Panasonic's first micro four thirds phase detection autofocus camera, finally, it's done a great job at catching up to Sony.
Let's talk about dynamic range. Now the G9 Mark II is listed at 13 plus stops where it's listed at 14 plus stops on the Sony FX30. But it's not just as simple as that, because I find Vlog on the Panasonic system far easier to get great results out of, just letting the camera do the work. On the Sony FX3, it's a convoluted menu system. You have to turn log shooting on. You also sometimes have to overexpose slightly, and if you're using one of the Cine EI options, it's very complicated if you're a beginner. Whereas on the Panasonic G9 Mark II, I can simply just hit record, choose Vlog in the picture profiles, and I'm good to go. The camera will set it up properly for me. So if you like to have the camera do the work, the Panasonic gets the win, and I think, at least to my eye, just dropping in the default LUT of choice on both cameras, I prefer the look of the Panasonic G9 Mark II, and I can get a better look with very little effort. Whereas on the FX30, I can still get a great look, but it takes a little bit more finessing to get everything the way that I like it. So the win goes to the G9 Mark II in terms of its color science and workflow, but we get a perceived one-stop difference on the Sony FX30. So you can make your mind up which one you like the best and why, just with a practical example like this.
Let's talk about low light performance. I had a chance to compare these two cameras a little while back on my initial review of the G9 Mark II, and I thought it held up really well up against the FX30, up to about ISO 4000 or so, and then the FX30 started looking better once you start pushing beyond that point. Now, neither of these two cameras are low light beasts. If you want that, you'll need to get a Sony FX30, A7S III, or the Panasonic S5 Mark II or X. All of those will give you better results than both of these. Now, you're buying a crop sensor camera and there's known limitations when it comes to low light performance in any crop sensor camera, so just keep that in mind. But in most shooting scenarios, with the fastest lens you can get your hands on, you should be able to get decent results in most shooting situations up to about ISO 3200 or 4000. I don't like pushing either of these two cameras past that point.
Let's talk quickly about color science. I think both of these cameras are very capable just with their built-in picture profiles. Now, on the G9 Mark II, I'm using the natural picture profile, which has been my long-term favorite. And on the Sony FX30, I'm using picture profile number 1, which is the movie picture profile. And I can get great results out of this. Anytime you see either of these two cameras in the studio, I'm shooting natural on my Panasonic cameras, and I'm shooting in picture profile 1 on any of my Sonys, because it just looks great. I have to do very little to get an awesome straight out of camera color and look. And I think they're both very comparable. This is completely subjective. Let us know which one you like the best just from this scene right here. And I look forward to your comments in the comment section. All right, let's do a quick vlogging test. Starting on the Panasonic G9 Mark II, I'm just holding the camera by the grip like this. And this is without any of the fancy E-stabilization modes on. So this is just the standard IBIS, which is class leading in my opinion. This is with the 9mm f1.7, giving us that 18mm field of view equivalent. So this is how it performs. Let's turn on the E-Stab. All right, this is standard E-stabilization mode. This drastically improves the overall stability of the shot. It also compensates for the corner wobble as well and only crops in a hair. So this is fantastic. You don't even need to go to high to get great results out of this camera, but guess what? We're gonna do that right now. And now we've got the E-stabilization on high, which gives us almost GoPro-like results. So if you're a vlogger, the G9 Mark II absolutely wipes the floor with the Sony. Even though the Sony has Catalyst Browse, which is software where you can get similar results to this by doing some post-production, this will save you all the hassle of doing that. And if you've got an old computer, you'd be waiting hours and hours for long clips to stabilize. I've done it, it sucks. This just simplifies the entire process. All right, let's see how the Sony FX30 does for a little vlogging. This is with the standard stabilization on, and I'm shooting this with the 15mm f1.4 Sony G APS-C lens. So this is a dedicated APS-C lens. It's nice and small. It's slightly larger than the 9mm I was just shooting the Panasonic clip with, but it gives you great results. And of course you can stabilize this in Catalyst Browse, but the standard stabilization mode's pretty awful. One of the big advantages that Sony has is I can switch modes to active while you see that crop from standard to active like that. It allows me to get better IBIS support in camera. So this is about the best that it can work. If you've got better vlogging technique than me, you might be able to make this work. But yeah, it's one of those sort of camera systems where if you're doing a lot of handheld work, I really don't recommend it. If you're doing a lot of gimbal work or tripod stuff, that's where this particular camera shines. The best stabilization by far is the G9II, and I'd rather have all of that done in camera than have to spend hours in post-production using Catalyst Browse, which kind of downsamples your 10-bit files to 8-bit unless you pay the fee. So I don't like paying to play, I just want it to work.
All right, let's wrap this up. Both of these cameras are solid performers and you can't go too far wrong with either. The G9II is a better hybrid camera overall, and some might argue a better video camera. I would argue that. It's capable of recording up to 5.8K open gate, 4K 120 frames per second without any additional crops, no overheating with the thermal set to high, ProRes recording, and 12-bit B-RAW external via HDMI. This is a total powerhouse in the form factor of a regular camera. The killer IBIS, 13 plus stops of dynamic range, and the full version of Vlog makes this a fantastic run and gun camera for any sort of YouTube or filmmaking work. It just does a great job. All right, let's talk about the Sony FX30. I have to give it to Sony with the body design of this camera. It's awesome. We get active cooling. We get the option to use either CF Express Type A cards or UHS-2 SD cards with this camera, so it gives you a backup recording option, but you can also use 2 different types of media, which is really cool. The build quality of this body, in my opinion, is better than the G9II just in terms of how it feels in the hand. It's an absolute tank. It has more of a video shooter centric design, so for video shooters you might prefer the design of this. If you're coming from normal mirrorless cameras, the build quality of the G9II is great, but there's a perceived difference just in how this feels in the hand. It has a metallic sort of body, whereas the LUMIX is mostly plastic. The only area that the FX30 falls apart for me is for handheld work. The IBIS just isn't very good. So if you're going to be shooting a lot of handheld run and gun documentary style stuff, the LUMIX cameras just do a far better job at stabilizing the sensor. Even the Panasonic full frame cameras are leagues ahead of the Sony FX30. And lastly, if background blur is important to you and you want that sort of soft background, the Sony FX30 makes getting that a lot easier. The larger sensor paired with the fast lenses will give you more shallow depth of field with equivalent settings over that of the LUMIX G9II. So just keep that in mind. There's a tool for the job, and if you really want that soft background, get a fast lens for the FX30. It will make that a bit easier. At the end of the day, I've been able to get excellent results out of both of these cameras, and if you buy one or the other, they're both awesome, which is why I have both. So yeah, keep that in mind. Thanks again for watching, and I will catch you very soon. See ya.